So mindfulness is for everyone. Mindfulness is really beneficial for everybody. And it's this sort of neuroscience that we're going to be looking at today. I think of mindfulness like being the operating manual for your mind. I really feel that everybody should be taught this so that we all know how to operate our brains. And mindfulness can help us, with the kind of minutiae of daily stresses in everyday life, when things go wrong, when minor things annoy us. Mindfulness helps with that. It helps us to deal with really challenging big life events like bereavement or the onset of an illness or redundancy, all these different things that are really big events. It helps with our overall emotional well-being and helps us to keep emotionally on a more resilient and stable keel. It helps us with our relationships. When we practice mindfulness, people report that their relationships improve and that they're able to relate to other people differently and in a more healthy way. It helps people with parenting. There's a whole thing around mindful parenting. And if we practice implementing the way of being with mindfulness when we're bringing children up, it can help enormously, both as parents and for the children as well. And it helps us in our working lives, people who are at work. It helps there's lots of studies about how practicing mindfulness can help in our dealing with the daily stresses of work life as well. So I really believe that mindfulness is a really useful tool for us to learn so that we can navigate all of these different challenges in life more easily and with, less distress. So a little bit about the history of mindfulness. Just to put it in some context, mindfulness is not a religion. It's not a belief system. It's not incompatible with any other religious belief. So if you're Christian or Hindu or Muslim or Jewish, you can practice mindfulness as well. It's not, a religion that, is in conflict with any of those other religious beliefs. It did originally come from Buddhism and Buddhist practice, and it's a form of mental training that Buddhists have practiced for centuries, but you don't have to be Buddhist to practice mindfulness, and mindfulness is not Buddhism. So it was sort of westernized and secularized, if you like, in the 1970s. One of the main movers and shakers in that movement was a chap called Jon Kabat-Zinn. And in the 1970s, he took Buddhist mindfulness practices and turned them into a secular, westernized way of doing mind training exercises. And he worked at the Center for Mindfulness at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. And he set up a program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. And he used that predominantly to help people who had incurable illness and chronic incurable pain conditions. So that's kind of where the roots of mindfulness came from. It was always originally to help people with pain and illness. But the interesting thing is that now we do brain scans and we look at scientific, analysis of the brain that we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. And that research is showing that these practices that Buddhist people have been doing for centuries actually do have real measurable benefits on our well-being and our brain health. So the tools that I work with and what I'm going to be talking about tonight are based on that neuroscience of how our brain works and how mindfulness changes the way our brain works for the better. And these tools teach us how to basically optimize our brain function. And I particularly focus on a short form of mindfulness. So they're very short practices. And that's something that's really important to understand, is that meditation practices can feel really inaccessible to us when we don't want to be spending hours like this Buddhist chap here on the screen, sitting in the lotus position. None of us are physically able to do that, and it feels really inaccessible. But you can practice really short mindfulness practices, and they can still have this measurable benefit on our brains. So that's worth understanding, that it can be really powerful, even just tiny bits of mindfulness. So what is mindfulness? The definition of mindfulness that I teach with is the act of becoming aware of our present moment experience and welcoming what we find with a kind and open heart. So that's the definition. Mindfulness is the act of becoming aware of our present moment experience and welcoming what we find with a kind and open heart. So there's two parts really to that definition. And the first part, becoming aware of our present moment experience. And this is about how much time we spend on autopilot, thinking about something other than what we're doing. We're washing up, but we're thinking about the doctor's appointment that we had yesterday, or we're trying to read, but we keep being distracted by thinking about something else. We're constantly, living our lives on autopilot. People who drive will recognize this experience of getting halfway home and not having any recollection of how you actually got there, because your brain is just automatically going through the motions, doing what it's always done. And we end up thinking about something that's different to what we're doing. So our bodies and our minds, if you like, are in two separate places. Our bodies and our minds are not together. And Jon Kabat-Zinn calls mindfulness the act of falling awake. And that is a really lovely way of describing it. So that moment when you suddenly come to your senses and realize, oh, I'm washing up, but I've been lost in thought, or oh, I'm driving and I don't know how I got here. That's an act of mindfulness. That is the moment when you come into your body and align with what you're actually doing and realize where you are and what you're doing. That act of falling awake in that moment. That is mindfulness in essence. And then the second part of this definition is welcoming whatever we find with a kind and open heart. So this is sometimes the part that people find the hardest. It's all very well to become aware of our present moment experience, but sometimes, as we know, what we're experiencing in the present moment is not as we would wish it to be. And there is difficulty in that present moment experience. There's pain, there's suffering, there's difficult emotions, there's stress, something happening in our lives that's hard. And this is where we really need to work and to adopt the mindfulness concepts of being non-judgmental and welcoming what we find, whatever is happening, with a friendly acceptance. And it involves a lot of kindness and compassion, treating ourselves with kindness and treating ourselves as we would treat other people. And that can take a huge amount of practice. That is almost the hardest bit of mindfulness, the bit that really we need to work on over and over and over again to implement these qualities of non-judgmentalness, of curiosity, kindness, friendly acceptance. And we'll be looking a little bit more as the talk goes on about what that means in practice. So we can't really talk about mindfulness without understanding a little bit about how the mind works. And we operate in various different modes. And there's thinking and doing modes, and there's being and observing modes. And when we talk about becoming aware of our present moment experience and this idea of being on autopilot, I usually ask people how much time they think we spend thinking about something other than what we're doing, lost in our thoughts, not fully present in this moment with our bodies. And whenever I ask a group of people that question, people say, oh, 70%, 80%, 90% of the time, they feel as though they're lost in their thoughts, they're thinking about something other than what they're doing, and they're going through their daily lives on autopilot. So actually in 2010, Harvard did a study and they came to the conclusion that it's about 50% of the time we're not actually thinking about what we're doing. And I think the fact that we all think it's a lot more than that just goes to show how much of that we have going on in our lives, and possibly also these Harvard students were maybe above average, and I feel as though I spend more than 50% of my time, if I'm really honest, on autopilot. But the same study also found that happiness is correlated to present moment experience, and what that means is that the more present we are, the happier we tend to be. And there's lots of neuroscience reasons why that is, which we're going to look at. And when we think about these modes of mind, thinking and doing mode, when we're on autopilot, we're in thinking and doing modes, and our brains are caught up constantly in this thinking, doing. And in our Western culture, we're taught from a very, very young age to use our thinking and doing modes of mind. At school, we're encouraged to think. Everything is all about how clever we are and how much brain power we have and how much we achieve every day and how many things we can tick off our list, and success, and is all tied to thinking and doing modes in our culture. And the thing is that our brains are made to think. Our brains are incredible, and the way that they think is amazing, and it enables us to do all of the incredible things that we do as human beings. So thinking is a good thing, and we can't stop our minds from thinking. There's a bit of a myth around meditation and mindfulness that in order to practice this, we have to completely wipe our minds of any thoughts and we have to stop thinking. And that's impossible, because our minds are made to think, and they do think. But the thing is that research is showing us that it's not healthy to be in thinking mode all the time. And then there's doing mode, which is very closely correlated to thinking. If you're in thinking mode, you're probably in doing mode as well. And my mindfulness teacher calls this strive overdrive. So you're ticking off things to do on the to-do list. You're thinking, I must do this, and then I must do that. And you're not even thinking about what you're doing now, because you're thinking about the next job on the list and when are you going to get to that, and tick, tick, tick. And we get addicted to that. And it does feel good, because it releases sort of dopamine in our brains, and we feel like, yeah, I've ticked everything off my list. And that kind of gives us a hit of good feeling chemicals, and we can feel that doing is great, and we love to tick things off a to-do list. I'm terrible for that. I do love a to-do list. But the thing is that we need to recognize that doing mode and thinking mode are recognized in our bodies as stress states. It's constantly triggering the fight or flight response and triggering our bodies to release adrenaline and cortisol, because this thinking and doing is perceived by the body as a stressor. So observing and being modes are some of the other ways in which our brains can operate, and we tend not to use these as much. So the opposite of thinking is observing mode, and we're just observing our present moment experience without judgment. This is being in the present moment. We're just observing the thoughts, the feelings, the sensations. We're just watching what's happening rather than thinking. We're watching and observing. And then the opposite of doing mode is being mode. And that is just being fully alive to this moment, not caught up in the endless to-do of what I must do next and what's next. It's just being alive in this moment and being fully immersed in that moment. And this lovely quote, you're a human being, not a human doing. So whenever I get caught up in my to-do list and I find myself ticking things off, I just say to myself, just remember you're a human being, not a human doing, and remind myself to just take a break from that. So when people talk about mindfulness, they generally talk a lot about the mental health benefits of mindfulness. And that's because there are large numbers of scientific studies which show that when we activate this being and observing modes in our brains, even just for a few minutes a day. And remember, I was talking about how just short practices can have powerful benefits. You only need to step into being or observing modes just for a few minutes a day, and we step out of that thinking doing cycle. it has measurable benefits for our mental health. It's been shown to improve mood, to increase our positive emotions and decrease negative emotions. It's been particularly shown to decrease anxiety and depression, and also reduce our emotional reactivity. So we're not on a really short fuse and we don't snap, so easily. When stressful things happen, we don't find them as stressful, and we find that we can ride through things, and it allows us to build up resilience to stress when we do that regularly, of stepping out of the thinking doing into being and observer modes. But the thing that really fascinates me and that I love to talk about is the fact that there are also lots and lots of studies that show that mindfulness also has lots of physical health benefits. It actually changes the way our bodies are working physically. So all of these things that I've put here have research studies that demonstrate it can lower blood pressure, it improves our heart health, it's been shown to improve our brain function, and even people with Alzheimer's, their symptoms have been shown to reduce with regular mindfulness practice. There were studies that show that it improves fatigue after a stroke or a brain injury. And the thing that really fascinates me is that when people practice mindfulness regularly, they're shown in their blood samples and swabs from their mouths, they have increased levels of T cells. So their immune system is boosted. So we fight off bugs and germs and viruses much more effectively. But at the same time, levels of inflammation in the body are also reduced. So when we practice meditation and mindfulness, particularly regularly, we reduce our levels of inflammation. It's been shown that people recover from wounds much faster when they regularly practice mindfulness. Even cellular aging, there's a little part of the cell of your DNA called telomeres at the end of the DNA. And as our cells age, those telomeres become worn, and that is basically what causes our genetic aging as we get older. But people who practice mindfulness regularly, their telomeres stay strong and healthy for much longer. So it's associated with reduced cellular aging. It has been shown to improve symptoms of pain and how the brain processes pain, linked to improved sleep, and also shown to improve gastrointestinal problems and, IBS and things like that. So lots and lots of physical health benefits as well from practicing mindfulness and doing this process of stepping out of thinking and doing mode and into being an observer mode just for a few minutes a day. All of these amazing benefits on our physical health. So how does mindfulness actually do that? What is happening here? And it's all to do with this tiny little part of our brain. We've got one in each hemisphere of our brain. It's called the amygdala. And you can just see it on screen there. This little tiny red dot, it's like an almond-shaped part of the brain. And when we're in thinking and doing mode, our amygdala is activated by all that thinking and doing and busyness. It switches on the amygdala. And the amygdala is part of our very primitive limbic brain, and it's the part of our brain that controls our emotions, particularly negative emotions like stress and anger and, sadness and depression and anxiety. They all come from the amygdala. So the amygdala is responsible for triggering the stress response. It's what puts us into fight or flight, or the freeze-fawn response. It's also responsible, very closely connected to the trauma response. And the amygdala is also responsible for us becoming mean to others, but also mean to ourselves. So that inner voice that tells you, oh, you're no good at this, or, oh, how rubbish you are at this or that. And we talk to ourselves with all that negative self-talk. That's your amygdala. That's your amygdala in action. And the amygdala is also involved in how we perceive pain. And the more time we spend in thinking and doing modes, the larger and more active and more dominant our amygdala becomes. So that becomes a part of our brain that kind of is in control and doing all of the work. And we can get into a state that's known as amygdala hijack. So we all know that when you've had a difficult thing happens and it really annoys you, and then something else happens, and then something else happens, and you have a week of everything going wrong, and somebody cuts you up on the roundabout and the printer jams, and something goes wrong at home, the boiler stops working, and somebody's rude to you on the telephone, or whatever is going on. And one thing we cope with reasonably well, but when we have more and more and more of those things, the amygdala gets more and more and more activated, and then by the end of the week, somebody just says to you quite innocently, "Oh, did you put the bin out, dear?" Or asks you a fairly innocuous question, and you suddenly find yourself shouting at them and saying, "Of course I haven't had time to put the bin out, don't you know how busy I am?" And then afterwards you think, "Oh, why did I overreact like that? Why did I do that?" And road rage is the absolutely classic example. Anyone who has been perpetrated road rage, they were in amygdala hijack. So the amygdala just takes over completely and triggers that fight or flight response, and it becomes the part of the brain that is in control and dominant. On the other side, being an observer mode, when we do this, stepping just for a few moments out of the thinking doing mode and into this position of being an observer position, it actually calms down the amygdala. It deactivates it, calms it down, and with it calms down all those negative emotions and switches off the fight or flight response, and instead activates the prefrontal cortex, which is this part of our brain at the front here, where we have all of our wisdom and our intelligence and our rational, calm, focused mind exists here in our prefrontal cortex. And when we're in observer position, that part of our brain lights up. And mainly, a large part of the benefit of practicing mindfulness regularly is that we're strengthening our connection to our prefrontal cortex, because every time we do a mindfulness practice and we step into being an observer mode, we strengthen that prefrontal cortex, we make that the dominant part of our brain, and we create neural pathways and strengthen the neural pathways to our prefrontal cortex, and we're squashing the amygdala down, and we're weakening it, and we're switching off the pathways that are going to the amygdala, so the amygdala becomes less active. And the interesting thing about these two parts of our brain is that we can't be in both at the same time. It's one or the other. They can't both be on, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And we all know this because we've all had that awful experience of being in an exam or a job interview when we're very stressed and the amygdala is on, we completely lose contact with the prefrontal cortex, which is where all of the information and our knowledge and our intelligence is stored, and we become completely unable to say anything coherent or write anything of any value in the exam because we're stuck in our amygdala. But the same is also true the other way round. So if we can switch on our prefrontal cortex, we're calming down the amygdala and switching that off. So brain scans are showing that people who practice mindfulness regularly actually change the physical structure of their brain. So our friend, the Buddhist monk over here, when their brains are scanned, their amygdala has actually shrunk. It's actually physically smaller than normal people's amygdalas, people who don't practice mindfulness regularly every day. However, for the rest of us, mere mortals, research shows that, as I said, just 8 to 10 minutes of practice a day also has measurable benefits on our physical and mental health. So we don't have to spend all day, every day, practicing mindfulness. And this amazing thing called neuroplasticity in our brain, when we repeatedly, intentionally choose to change our state of focus and switch off that doing and thinking mode and come into the present moment, and then cultivate these key mindfulness qualities that I talked about, like compassion and non-judgmentalness, that actually changes the way our brains function and the way our brains are structured through neuroplasticity. It's that daily practice, every single day. Just doing 1 minute of mindfulness a day is much more beneficial than doing a retreat and spending a whole week practicing mindfulness and then never doing it again, because you're not actually changing the neuroplasticity of your brain and the structure of your brain. Whereas when you do regular practices, 2-3 minutes a day, every day, that's when you start to get this neuroplasticity and the brain actually starts to change in the way it functions. And then that's when we see all these mental and physical health benefits that we talked about happening. So just to talk, I've mentioned a little bit about mindfulness and pain, and this is one of the most interesting things about mindfulness. There's been some research studies, one in particular, that showed that regularly practicing mindfulness 20 minutes a day for 4 days, and it had a measurable impact in brain scans on 3 different areas of the brain that are associated with pain. So the thalamus is like the gateway into the brain. No signal from our body other than smell, which goes straight into the olfactory nerve and straight into the brain up our noses. But every other sensory input from the body has to pass through our nervous system and then through the thalamus into the brain for it to be registered by the brain. And when we practice mindfulness, the thalamus has been shown to become disengaged and downregulated. So basically mindfulness is closing the gate to physical sensations entering the brain. So a lot of people find that when they practice mindfulness, their pain levels go down, and that would explain why, because the brain is not receiving those pain signals through the thalamus. And then another area of the brain, the primary somatosensory cortex, that's associated with processing how intense sensations are and where they are in the body. That's also been shown to be downregulated and disconnected during mindfulness practices. And then our old friend, the amygdala, and that unsurprisingly is connected very strongly with the emotional component of pain. So how distressing the pain feels to us, how upset we are about pain, is the amygdala that's generating that. And as we've seen, that becomes downregulated and calmed down during mindfulness practice. So we find when we practice mindfulness that although the physical sensations might still be there, they don't actually bother us as much and we don't find them distressing. And that can be a big component of how mindfulness helps us when we live with physical suffering and pain. So just a word here as well about how mindfulness works with our brain waves. So meditation and mindfulness are quite often used interchangeably, and I've said meditation a few times, but they are slightly different in the way that they operate. And meditation is an element of mindfulness, but it's not the whole of mindfulness practice. There are other techniques within mindfulness that don't involve the same techniques as meditation, but you can do meditation practice as part of mindfulness. And when we meditate, brain scans show that our frequency of our brain waves actually changes. So when we meditate, we're actually influencing the speed and the pattern of our brain waves. And brainwave speed is measured in this unit of frequency called hertz. And there are 5 different frequencies of brain waves that we move in and out of during the course of any 24-hour period. And the frequency of our brain waves and how fast and the pattern that our brain waves are moving in changes depending on what functions our brain is performing. So we have different brain waves when we're asleep and when we're awake, when we're really concentrating on something, or when we're a bit sort of away with the fairies and daydreaming. Our brain waves are changing. And these are the 5 different brainwave frequencies. So gamma is probably when you're in that exam or when you're in that interview. This is the peak frequency when you're concentrating absolutely on what you're doing, and it's the state of complete focus. And then beneath that we have beta, and beta is where we are now. It's where you operate on a day-to-day basis when you're alert and doing stuff, but you're not massively concentrating, but you're just talking to people, reading things, writing things, searching on the internet. That's beta. Then when we become really relaxed, we drop down into alpha, and the brain is alert. We're not asleep, but we're not actively thinking. We're just in a state of relaxation. And then if our brainwaves slow down even more, we enter theta. And this is, again, we're conscious, we're not asleep, but this is the state that we access during hypnosis and meditation, and also when we're daydreaming and lost in our memories and we're sort of focused on our internal world. It's that state that you go into when you're watching a film or you're reading a book and you're so engrossed in the story that you completely forget that you're sitting in your living room, and when the advert break comes on or you stop reading or someone comes into the room, you sort of think, oh gosh, where am I? Oh, I'm here, I'm not there in, in Star Wars or whatever you were watching. That's theta state, when we're deeply engrossed in something and our brain waves are really very slow then. And then delta is the very slowest of all, and that's when we're deeply, deeply asleep. And as I said, there are differences between mindfulness and meditation, but when we're practicing mindfulness, our brain waves do drop down into the alpha and the theta levels of brain frequency, and they've been shown to be very beneficial states for us to be in, and it helps us to access our subconscious and our creativity, and also puts us into the parasympathetic nervous state where we can go into rest and digest. And the thing with mindfulness, though, is that we don't have to access these really deep states. A lot of people feel that meditation is kind of inaccessible to them because they struggle to, for whatever reason, particularly if they're neurodiverse, you struggle to get into those really deep states of slow brain waves and relaxation. And so people sort of think, well, I can't meditate, and so I can't get any benefit from any of these practices. It's kind of excluded. I'm excluded from that benefit. But actually, mindfulness practice, we can also practice mindfulness in beta and in alpha, so we don't have to get into these really deep states for us to benefit, but we can as part of our mindfulness practice. So some people find that they do, and the more regularly we practice mindfulness and the more adept we've become at practicing mindfulness, the more regularly we do it and the more skillful we become at using mindfulness, we can find that we do enter or begin to enter these theta, alpha and theta states more easily. So it is something that can be learned through practice. But even if you do struggle and you're not able to access those deep brain states, you can still benefit from mindfulness tools, because we can practice mindfulness when we're moving, when we're walking, when we're doing all sorts of active things too. But that's just something to be aware of. And I mentioned the key qualities of mindfulness. So there are various things that we strive to incorporate into our lives when we practice mindfulness. And I'm smiling because non-striving is one of them, so I shouldn't have chosen the word striving. But as I've talked about observer mode and being mode, so we operate within the observer position and we try to be fully present in our present moment of life. Not all the time, because no one can maintain that 24/7, but we look to incorporate this into our daily lives, being in observer position and in being mode. And the quality of non-judgment, so beginning to practice not judging things and just allowing things to be as they are and being okay with that, and bringing in this quality of curiosity as well, looking at things with new eyes as though we've never seen them before, as though we were a child again, or like an alien beamed in from outer space, and looking at the flower, looking at the tree and not taking it for granted, but actually looking at it with that curiosity and thinking, gosh, I never realized how beautiful that is. And also the concept of duality, that things can be good and bad at the same time. We tend to think in very black and white terms. We are very, very sick, or life is perfect and everything's fine, or we're having a really bad day and then that the whole day is just terrible, or we're having a good day and that whole day must be marvelous for it to be a good day. But actually in mindfulness we practice duality, so things can be good and bad at the same time. Within the space of one day there will be some good things and some bad things, and we can be poorly and we can also have good experiences whilst we're poorly. It's not one or the other, it's not binary. And then again, I've talked a little bit there about beginner's mind. So, having this, looking at things from a beginner's perspective, not being stuck in autopilot where we just take everything for granted and we don't even see the sunset because we're not thinking about the sunset. We start seeing the world around us as though we've never seen it before and really engaging with that. And this concept of non-striving, which is really hard for us in Western society because we are trained to strive for success. And actually in mindfulness, we do obviously do things and we want things to happen and we work for things, but we try not to strive. We try not to get sucked into that doing mode where we're constantly just on a treadmill of ticking things off the list. Acceptance, some people find that a really hard concept, but in mindfulness, we're talking really about acceptance in the moment. So not accepting that this is like it is forever. It's not that this will always be this way. It's not giving up. It's not surrender. It's acceptance that right now, this is what's happening and there's no point in fighting against it. And another word that we can use is acknowledgement, which some people find more comfortable. So we're just acknowledging what is in this present moment. Gratitude, again, we bring some gratitude elements into our practice. Compassion is a huge part. It's a whole separate talk, and there's some lovely resources online if you're interested in compassion practice. Compassion for others and compassion for ourselves, and compassion for ourselves first, because we can't pour from an empty cup. So we have to fill ourselves up and give ourselves love and compassion and then spread that out to other people. So when we put all of this together, we realize that mindfulness is not really just, practice. It's not something you do for a few minutes and then get on with your day. It's something that actually becomes a way of life. It's an attitude that we choose to adopt as we move through life, because we realize all of the benefits that being in these positions have for us neurologically and on our physical and mental and emotional well-being. So we're working to adopt these practices and live in a way that is mindful, with a mindful attitude during our lives on a day-to-day basis. So I thought I'd do a little practice now. If people want to, you can just take a few moments. It's a very short practice. We're just going to explore the inner observer. So I've talked a little bit about observing mode and the observer position, but what exactly does that mean? So I'm just going to do a little practice. And if you want to, you can just take a few moments and just explore this and just see how you find this, and whether you can get in touch with your observer mode. So wherever you are, just getting comfortable, however that looks for you, just for the next few moments, somewhere where you can just rest. And if you want to, you can close your eyes, but you don't have to. And just begin by taking some nice, long, deep, slow breaths in and out, just in your own time, to the rhythm of your own breathing. We're not trying to force the breath or change the breath or count the breath. We're just breathing in, maybe sighing it out. And just allowing the breath to take you into yourself just for a few moments, just connecting in with you, coming home to you and your body. Maybe just noticing whether the out breath can be a little bit longer than the in breath, a little bit of a sigh. And just for the next few moments, we're just going to take our awareness to the breath and observe the breath as it comes naturally. If that feels okay, just sitting with the breath. And again, we're not trying to change anything. We're just allowing it to be as it is. Noticing if you begin to judge that breath in some way or criticize, just notice that happening and then see if you can let that go and just allow the breath to be as it is. However it is for you right now is perfect for you. There's no right or wrong. We're just observing the breath. We're just watching the breath and noticing how you breathe. your own personal experience of your breath that is unique to you. And whatever is happening for you, just watch that and allow it to be as it is. There's no right or wrong. And you might notice that your mind is wandering, or you might have questions, or you might be analysing or thinking. You might notice feelings of impatience or boredom. You might find yourself drifting off to think about what you're going to have for tea tomorrow night. Just notice that. That's the moment when you've fallen awake. And you suddenly realize that your mind has wandered away from the breath. And all you need to do is just notice that happening, that beautiful moment of falling awake, and bring your awareness back to the breath. And just observing the movement of your body as you breathe, where you feel the breath in your body, in your nose. Maybe it's the rise and fall of your chest. Or maybe there's a movement in your tummy. Wherever you feel the breath, just rest your awareness there and just watch it. Just observing the breath. And if you want to, you can take your awareness away from your breath into the physical sensation of your body in contact with some other surface. If the breath doesn't feel good with you, then you can connect into the physical sensation of your legs on the chair, your feet on the floor, your hands on the lap. Anywhere where you can feel a sensation of your body in contact with another surface. And just observe that. Just explore that area where you end and the surface begins. In your mind, focus on that physical sensation of contact and connection and what you notice there. Is there a sense of pressure, of warmth? Is the surface beneath you hard or soft? You're just watching that now, just observing that sensation. And we're just seeing if you can allow yourself to connect with a sense of yourself, the you that is not your breath, and the you that is not the physical sensations you can feel, and the you that is not your thoughts when your mind wanders off. Because you are none of these things. You are the one that observes the breath, the one observing the physical sensations. You are the one observing the thoughts. That inner observer that watches the breath and watches the thoughts and watches the sensations. Just seeing if you can become aware of that amazing inner part of your brain, your inner watcher. That inner watcher is the wisest, most inner part of yourself. your true self, the store of your inner wisdom, your inner guide, available to you whenever you need it. And then whenever you're ready, just taking a nice deep breath in, and then allowing your exhale to bring you slowly and gently back into the room around you, becoming aware of your surroundings and opening your eyes whenever you feel ready, and coming back into the present moment. So I'd be interested to know in the chat, maybe at the end, you can let me know how you found that. I'm just going to quickly talk a little bit now just about how mindfulness helps us in our daily lives and some of the ways in which we can use these techniques to help us. So our health, we've talked about the physical benefits of mindfulness. And when we experience stress on a daily basis and we get a hit of adrenaline every single time an email arrives, the phone rings, somebody does something that annoys us, we feel some pressure to get something done, that's all triggering adrenaline and triggering our amygdala. Constantly triggering in our daily lives. Our amygdala is constantly triggered. But actually, the amygdala is only supposed to trigger when we're genuinely facing a life-threatening situation. And when we think about it, how many of those daily events that we've experienced in the course of the last day or the last week, how many of those events were genuinely life-threatening? The doorbell ringing, somebody annoying us, somebody cutting us up on the roundabout. Generally speaking, not many of those events that happen to us are life-threatening, but our amygdala is constantly reacting as though it is. And nobody can live healthily in a constant state of being triggered with our amygdala triggering adrenaline constantly in our bodies, because we weren't designed to live in that state. It's only supposed to switch on when we have to run away from the saber-toothed tiger. That is the only time that the amygdala should activate. And all of this research now is showing that all of the major diseases that we experience are linked to this constant triggering of stress by our amygdala. If we constantly keep triggering the amygdala, it leads to illness. And the question we need to ask ourselves is what we feel stressed about on a daily basis, is that worth making ourselves ill, or in our case, making ourselves even iller? Because this becomes even more pertinent and relevant when we already live with illness. We don't need all of this additional illness and additional stress on top of that. So the more we can keep ourselves out of that fight or flight response, the more we can keep our amygdala calm, the more it helps us to be as healthy as we possibly can be without an additional layer of ill health and stress on top of MCAS. So in our daily life, at work, if we're working, or whatever we're doing with our time on a daily basis, studies show that when we regularly do these practices, it increases our attention span and our focus and our concentration and our mental clarity. And also when we add in that self-compassion element and forgiveness, actually, when we forgive ourselves for mistakes, we're less likely to make that mistake again. And that is obviously because when we beat ourselves up and we get angry and distressed and feel shame and upset for making a mistake, we're in our amygdala, which means our prefrontal cortex is switched off. So we have no chance of learning from that mistake and recognizing how to avoid it in future. So the studies are quite clear that when we are kind to ourselves when we make a mistake, it's actually much more beneficial for our physical health and mental and emotional health, but also in practical terms makes us able to learn from the mistake and not make it again. And regular mindfulness practice, again, is linked to reducing burnout risk because it increases our resilience. It calms that amygdala down, so we're not constantly feeling overwhelmed and on a knife edge, constantly on a short fuse. Our fuse becomes much longer when we practice mindfulness regularly, so we can cope with things much more easily. And also creativity and innovation. As I said, we're switching on that amazing part of our brain, and we also enter that slower brainwave state where we can become more creative and imaginative and come up with ideas. So I love this quote. The Dalai Lama was asked how he has time to fit in his meditation practice. And he says that on normal days, he meditates for an hour in the morning, but on really busy days, he meditates for 2 hours in the morning. And that's just one of these things that people who get into meditation find that actually they're more productive. The more time they spend meditating, the more they can do. Problem solving is affected by mindfulness practice, because your amygdala will never ever solve your problems for you. And we use this term blind panic for a good reason, because when we're in our amygdala and we're in that state of panic, we cannot see metaphorically what to do, but literally as well. It's a survival thing that our field of vision narrows physically, so we can only see what's right in front of our nose, because we need to be concentrating on the saber-toothed tiger in a life or death situation. We don't want to be distracted by, oh, there's a pretty butterfly up here. So our field of vision narrows. So literally we find when we're in a panic, we've all done it, we can't see the car keys, and the more stressed we become about with the fact that we can't see the car keys, the less likely we are to be able to see the fact that they're just there in front of us. We literally become blinded when we're in that panic state and when we're in the amygdala. Whereas our wisdom and our intelligence and all our problem-solving qualities are up here in our prefrontal cortex. So when we practice mindfulness and we strengthen that connection with the prefrontal cortex, we have access to all of those problem-solving abilities. And the amygdala is around about 2 to 4 years old in terms of intelligence. It's like a very small child, and it does the tantrum thing. It throws a tantrum a little bit like a 2-year-old child will do. And we really don't want a 2-year-old child or a part of our brain that has the intelligence of a 2-year-old child to be in charge of running us and solving our problems, because that's never going to work terribly well. So unless your problem is genuinely life-threatening and you need your fight or flight, your amygdala is really not going to help you that much. So it's good to practice mindfulness so we get better at doing problem solving. Compassion and connection is another thing, because when we're stressed or angry, we've all experienced this. When we get into a state of being stressed and our amygdala is activated, we literally lose our compassion for other people. We lose our empathy. We lose our ability to be kind. We all find ourselves snapping at people and being unkind, and then thinking afterwards, why was I so mean to that person? And it's because we were in amygdala hijack. As I said, the amygdala is responsible for being mean to ourselves and to others. And the reason for that is a survival mechanism. In a life or death situation, your amygdala does not want you feeling compassion for the person next to you, because it might be you or them. And your amygdala is only interested in you and keeping you alive. So in the moment, it will compel you to save yourself at somebody else's expense. And that's just a fact. It's just how we're designed in a survival situation. But the more we become stuck in this doing and thinking mode, and the more our society becomes more and more stress orientated, and the more our amygdala becomes activated, the less compassion, the less kindness we start to see people exhibiting to other people. Whereas when we're in our prefrontal cortex, we are compassionate. We can look at another person and we can think, we can understand why they're behaving the way they're behaving. We can rationalize it, we can think it through, and we become much more compassionate towards other people. And we can cultivate compassion actively for other people as mindfulness practice, but also for ourselves. So we can learn to switch on compassion. And when we do that, genuinely feel compassion, we generate positive chemicals like oxytocin, serotonin, nitric oxide. All of these are an antidote to stress. They're the opposite of adrenaline and cortisol, and they all have really beneficial effects for our mental health, but also our physical body and how well our physical body is functioning. So the more we can cultivate compassion and generate these good positive chemicals, the healthier and happier we are. And it all adds to down regulating that amygdala and calming it down. There's some really good resources and loads of interesting research about compassion by Brené Brown and Kristen Neff. They're two really leading figures in the world of compassion research. So if you're interested in this, look them up online because there's a lot on their websites. And emotional regulation, I've talked about, regulating our emotions and becoming more resilient. And in our Western culture, we're taught from a very early age that there are some emotions that are good and some emotions are bad, and we mustn't feel those. And we're encouraged from childhood to suppress our bad emotions. We mustn't get angry, we mustn't cry, we mustn't get upset because, the adults around us say things to us like, oh, don't cry, or, don't be angry. And actually, we're human beings and we experience a whole spectrum of emotions, and that's really normal and natural for every human being. There are no such things as bad emotions, because emotions are actually just messages. Our body is telling us something through our emotions. So in mindfulness practice, we recognize emotions, all emotions, as being helpful in some way, and we practice sitting with them and observing them. Again, that observing position. When we start to observe our emotions instead of being caught up in them, we observe them, and then we can see with our prefrontal cortex what the message is. So we feel sad or we feel lonely, we need connection with other people. Our body is telling us we don't have connection with others that we need. So that enables us to take action. Or we feel angry. There's a reason for that. What is our body telling us? Why are we angry? And what do we need to do about that? So we can learn to understand our emotions and work with them rather than fighting against them. As I said at the beginning, there's a whole world of mindfulness practice which is based around mindful parenting, and you can look up the mindful parenting online. The National Childbirth Trust, the NCT, have these resources, and there's principles of mindful parenting, like listening to your child with your full attention, non-judgment again of yourself and your child, being emotionally aware of yourself and your child's emotions, and using those self-regulation practices in the relationship with the child, and compassion, having compassion for yourself and for the child. There's lots and lots of ways in which mindfulness and behaving in a way that is mindful when you're raising a child can help both you and the child. And obviously you're then modeling helpful coping strategies to the child as the child is growing up. Mindful eating, a whole diet industry based around mindful eating, or eating in a way that is mindful. And this lovely quote by Thich Nhat Hanh: if you truly get in touch with a piece of carrot, you get in touch with the soil, the rain, the sunshine. You get in touch with Mother Earth. And by eating in such a way, you feel in touch with true life, your roots, and that's meditation. If we chew every morsel of our food in that way, we become grateful. And when you are grateful, you are happy. So when we eat in a way that is present, and we tend to sort of stuff our food down while we're doing something else, and that leads to all sorts of digestive problems. It means that we're in a stress state, so we're not able to digest our food properly and absorb it. We become much more aware of the foods that are good for us and the foods that are bad for us. And with an MCAS perspective, we can sometimes become very attuned to the foods that we're not going to tolerate well. When we actually listen and we eat mindfully, you get those signals. And we also increase our awareness of our signals for hunger, but also satiety. So when we're stressed, it reduces the way we respond to leptin, which is the hormone that is responsible for suppressing hunger. So we eat more when we're stressed, And we are also producing more ghrelin, which is the hormone responsible for appetite. So we are more likely to overeat and also deposit fat when we're stressed. Whereas when we eat mindfully, we put ourselves into a parasympathetic state, and then we get those signals. We understand when we're hungry, and we understand when we're full, and we understand what food we want and what food we don't want, and when we're relaxed and our food can be digested properly and we absorb the nutrients, and that is a really helpful way to eat. And so a lot of people, advocate taking a few moments, literally just a few seconds before you eat, to just switch off, take some mindful breaths, step into that observer position, and eat with your mind fully focused on eating, not eating whilst you're thinking about something else on autopilot, eating and thinking how nice the carrot is, eating and thinking how nice the food that you're eating is and what it really tastes like, what it smells like. Is it good for you? Do you want it? Really connecting in with the food. That's a way of eating mindfully. So there's a myth about mindfulness, and I've touched on this already, that it's about relaxation and that you've got to be totally zenned out and in a state of complete horizontal, practically comatose, in order to have practiced mindfulness. But it isn't actually about relaxation. It's about focus of attention and quality of attention. So you don't actually have to be relaxed to practice mindfulness. You don't have to sit still. You don't have to close your eyes. And if you don't want to, you don't have to focus your attention on your breath, because some people find sitting with the breath is difficult. And if you found that practice earlier difficult to connect with your breath, that is really quite common, particularly if we have breathing problems, or also if we have anxiety, the breath can feel tricky. And so don't worry about that, because it's not the only way to practice mindfulness. So we can do mindful movement, as we've just seen. We can do mindful eating and drinking. You can observe anything that's happening in your present moment experience mindfully. If you're completely engaged and focused on what you're doing, that's mindfulness. And so even if you're sitting there observing the fact that you don't feel very relaxed, as long as you're observing that without judgment or criticism, and you're just allowing that to be and exploring that with compassion, you're practicing mindfulness. You don't have to be in a state of complete relaxation. And there are lots of ways that mindfulness can be adapted if you're neurodiverse as well, because obviously that helps to be able to make mindfulness practice work for you and for your particular brain. There's no one way of practicing mindfulness. You can do anything mindfully. So it's just about playing around with the tools and the techniques and finding the ones that work for you. And so it's very adaptable, it's very flexible. So how do we become mindful? Connection with the breath, I've talked about. Connection with physical sensations in the body. So we talked a little bit in that practice about connecting to the surface beneath you and feeling that warmth and that pressure. So physical sensations in the body, any senses will connect you into the present moment. So what you're listening to, what you're smelling, what you're tasting, what you're touching, what you're seeing, that is all going to connect you to the present moment. You can't be smelling something and thinking about something else. You're smelling in the moment. You're in the present moment. Movement, as I said, we can do mindful walking, mindful exercising, anything at all that allows you to observe your present moment experience and then combine that with that self-compassion. And we use all of those tools to bring us into those being and observer modes, even fleetingly. It's just for a few moments. Even if you can only fit in 30 seconds of practice, you can do that every day, and that really helps. It starts that process of training your brain, and it's regular repetition. It's like anything else. It's like learning a language, playing the piano, going to the gym. You have to keep doing the weights in order to grow the muscle, and the brain is the same. Just have to keep practicing these tools over and over again, and it's that repetition that has that benefit. And a lot of people give up because they think, oh, my mind has wandered and I'm no good at this, I can't meditate. That's the moment when you've succeeded. That's the moment when you've fallen awake and you've realized that your mind has wandered, that's it, you're doing it. Don't give up at that moment. Just bring your attention back to the breath. And the next time you find your mind has wandered, brilliant. You've noticed again, you've fallen awake again. Bring your attention back to the breath, or whatever it is you're focusing on, the sounds that you can hear or the smells. Just keep bringing your attention back. That is the practice of mindfulness. You're not failing by doing that. That's what it is. And I've put here the lotus flower breathing. Joy has made a worksheet that you can download from the Mast Action website. But this is a really lovely dual focus practice that people with busy brains find. And it's really easy. You can do it wherever you are. Just hold your hand up as though it were a lotus flower. So your fingers are closed together as though they're the petals of a lotus flower. And as you breathe in, open the fingers like the petals opening. And then as you breathe out, close the fingers. Breathe in and open the fingers. Breathe out and close the fingers. And we're concentrating here on synchronizing the breath in with the movement of the fingers so that we're moving them exactly in time with the breath, in and out, open and closed, exactly synchronized with each other. And just sit for a few moments wherever you are and just focus on your breath and the movement of your hand. And if you've got a really busy brain, this one's really good because it gives your brain plenty to do. It's not just one thing to do, there's two things to do. So you're focusing on the breath and the movement of the hand together. So that's the lotus flower breathing, and lots of people that I teach that to find it really beneficial and they really like that one. So it's experiential. It's about doing, not knowing. So we have to actually practice the mindfulness. So some really simple things. One mindful breath when you wake up first thing in the morning. Just focus on that breath. Practice sitting and tuning into the breath just for 30 seconds or a minute like we did in the mindfulness practice. Do that lotus flower breathing. Stop what you're doing once a day and ask yourself, what do I need right now? That is an act of mindfulness, just tuning into your body, into your present moment experience, switching everything else off and just thinking, what do I need right now? And then there's mindful doing. Chores, anything that you do, you can do mindfully. Take the bin out mindfully, wash the dishes mindfully, have a shower mindfully, fully engaged and present in that, not away thinking about something else, but thinking about having a shower whilst you're having a shower, smelling the smells, feeling the water, brushing your teeth, tasting the toothpaste, feeling the sensation in your mouth, looking up at the stars as you take the bin out. Being fully present and engaged in that task, whatever task you're doing, do it mindfully. And finally, this lovely quote by Buddha, don't try to calm the storm, calm yourself, the storm will pass. And mindfulness is one of the best tools we have to calm ourselves whilst any storm is raging around us, whether that is a storm of some kind of stressful situation or whether that's an MCAS reaction or whatever it is you're experiencing. Mindfulness can help us to just ride through that more easily. So there's some free downloads of mindfulness meditations and recordings on my website at livewellwithchronicillness.co.uk. They're free, just download them, can have a little taster. There's free mindfulness apps like Insight Timer, that's a lovely one. As I said, Brené Brown, Kristen Neff, Sharon Salzberg, they've all got resources on their websites. And there's also the Mindfulness Exercises podcast. I recommend that. A chap called Sean Fargo, he does this podcast and they do lots of lovely talking about mindfulness and also practices. So there's some resources there. I'm going to share the slides. So if you're interested in finding out more, there's some books and some articles there you can read. My contact details, so you can go on my website or follow me on Facebook or Instagram, whatever works for you. And if you've got any questions, there's my email address there. I will take a few questions, but I know we've overrun. So if you have, if I don't get round to all the questions, feel free to email me, livewellwithchronicillness@outlook.com.